Good afternoon, everybody. This is what you get when you have the post-lunch food coma time slot. So good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
There we go. It is my pleasure to be chairing this panel. Yesterday afternoon, I spent an hour standing outside of Our Lady of Good Health Parish in South Scarborough. It is a Tamil Roman Catholic parish. Welcoming their worshipers as they came into the church a week after the Easter Sunday bombings in Sri Lanka. It was a ring of peace, which is something I know many of us in this room are now familiar with, I would say unfortunately, that was organized by the Toronto Board of Rabbis. And for a moment I just want to reflect how strange this is, that here you have a group of rabbis and Jews and a few others who are bringing comfort to a group of Catholics. This has not happened historically. The two groups did not intermingle on this level, and generally speaking, the Jewish community did not look to the Catholics, the Christian community generally, and say, we are going to go to your houses of worship to do something kind for you. Because let's just say it didn't happen the opposite direction either. And yet here is where we find ourselves in Toronto in 2019. And when I went to this church, as I have gone to mosques following the Quebec City shooting and following the attack in Christchurch, I went not just as a human, I didn't just go as a Canadian, I specifically went as a Jew and as a rabbi. It was important for me to express my faith through the support and bringing comfort to others in their time of need. And it's something which has been returned to my community, unfortunately, as well. We each have our identities, and we are able to find sometimes some common ground together, which is, of course, the theme of our general conference at this age of transition. Common ground is generally easy for the extreme things, i.e., I'm really sorry that something terrible happened to co-religionists somewhere else around the world. It gets harder as we get closer to home, and it gets harder when we move away from obvious hatred and violence to other issues which perhaps are trickier and more slippery. The theme we're beginning this afternoon is extremism and polarization. And we're going to be approaching this theme from three different vantage points. One academic, one practitioner in a particular religious community, and one political. On my immediate left, we have Professor Anna Sue, who is an assistant professor here at the University of Toronto Law School with a focus on law and religion. To her left is Mustafa Farooq, and we want to say welcome to your new position as of last Monday as Executive Director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. And on his left is Giuliana Natale, who is representing Global Affairs Canada, as Director of Inclusion and Religious Freedom Division within the Office of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion. And I should mention, I forgot, that Mustafa has a book to be published soon by Routledge about extremism and violence. For the full bios, please see your program. All presenters will speak for 10 to 12 minutes. After which we're going to have time for some dialogue up here and a few minutes for questions at the end. Dr. Sue, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. Today, I'm charged with speaking about the role of religion in addressing extremism and polarization. So sadly, this topic has become too timely again. When I was trying to write my remarks, I had to change it like 3 times. Because then I had to include the tragedy in Christchurch, the Easter bombings in Sri Lanka, and then the shooting in the Poway synagogue the other day. And so a topic like this, when I think about it, it can be approached, I think, from 2 different angles, right? So the first is from the perspective of someone in society, like any of us here, in how we deal with the challenges when we are confronted with the challenges that we're confronted with today. The other one, for instance, how do we deal, for us as religious believers, how do we search for common ground with other people who might not share our faith as we advance towards a common goal? The answer to that question might be different, say in a place like Canada. It might be different in a country somewhere in Asia, maybe different somewhere in Europe. But there's another way of looking at it. The second way is from the perspective of those in government, right? From the perspective of those people in authority, they look at religion in a particular way, right? So on the one hand, you want religious freedom as an important policy goal, but at the same time, you're also looking at religion as an object of regulation and surveillance. And so those two approaches are not necessarily separate, but because I only have 10 minutes or so, I'll just focus on the second one because that's what I did most of my research on. And so, so we can talk more about the other approach in the Q&A perhaps if we have time. So let me begin with some preliminaries. According to the Pew Research report, Christianity, a huge percentage of people in the world continue to be religious. So Christianity might be a dying religion in Europe, for example, but it's still the largest religious group in the world, with Christians making up nearly a third of the world's total population. And most of them live in the United States, Brazil, Mexico, and others. Here in Canada, the latest results of a 2011 survey, so this might have dramatically changed already in the past 8 years, over 60% of people identify with a Christian religion. So what do these demographic numbers, what do these facts mean for a government such as Canada? Now, both the regulation of religion and promotion of religious freedom are now regular components of government foreign policy, right? Either domestic or foreign. So my remarks will be more on the foreign side, but we can talk about the domestic one again later. So the US government was a pioneer of this religious freedom promotion even before the 9/11 attacks, for instance. Its rich history tells us a lot about something that is now very commonplace among governments. So after 9/11 and throughout the global war on terror, governments such as the US, Canada, and the UK embarked on a counter-radicalization strategy, or countering violent extremism, so CVE, that saw religion, and at this moment, around 2004, 2005, the attention was really on Islam and Islamic terrorism, both as a problem and a solution, right? So the term counter-radicalization itself is very problematic, but for now, we'll just use it as it is. But in practice, this meant that governments fund moderate clerics, for example, right? Or the building of schools that will espouse liberal values or tolerant versions of Islam, or the funding of local civil society organizations and strategic communications projects in places such as Pakistan, Egypt, and other places in the Middle East to carry out counter extremists or counter violence messaging. Right? So beginning that period, the promotion of religious freedom became very important to the national security interests of many Western governments. So in the US, there is an Office of Religious Freedom headed by an ambassador housed within the State Department. Here in Canada and the European Union followed suit afterwards. So former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, for example, established an office in 2013 headed by Reverend Andrew Bennett, which was closed by the new government in almost 3 years later, in favor of an office that is more broadly focused on human rights. In the EU, or the European Union, Jan Fiegel was appointed as the special envoy for religious freedom for the European Union in 2016. Now, apart from these offices, I mean, these are just institutional manifestations of how important religious freedom is. Religious freedom promotion is also a core part of various US government policies, for example, including its national security strategy. Now, there are many scholars skeptical of this development. Political scientists, for example, such as Elizabeth Shackman Hurd of Northwestern University, criticize this development. She calls this expert religion, right? By that, she means that when government officials and policy experts talk about religion in a way that is relevant for policymaking, they're really talking about two phases of religion. The first one is a very naive celebration of religion as the source of community, of morality, but then the other phase sees religion as a danger to be controlled, and a danger to be reformed and policed, right? And it looks at it as a source of global instability. And so this framing produces not so great consequences, according to Hurd. She says it drives government support for certain religious authorities. In other words, it involves governments to try to pick out which religions are good or which religions are bad and therefore not worthy of support. And secondly, it makes religion an object of reform. Now, there's something to this critique. I mean, I don't agree completely with her, with some of her. I mean, she's like one of many critics, but I think she's one of the strongest to this effect. I don't completely agree with it. I do think that at this point in history, there's really there's something to this critique, though. I mean, I don't think it's completely realistic to not for governments to ignore religion or religious freedom altogether as part of policy, but there is something to her critique as well, right? So contemporary CVE, or countering violent extremism and religious freedom policy, both internationally and domestically, tends to instrumentalize religious actors. For example, a government initiative may seek moderate, what they deem to be, who they deem to be moderate religious leaders, to offer counter narratives to violent interpretations of religious scripture, right? And then offering to support that religious leader. And when we do this, when we instrumentalize religious actors, it's counterproductive and therefore dangerous because of the complex situations that religious leaders in those countries find themselves in, right? What happens to those leaders who are part of non-traditional religions, who are part of the unorthodox branches of their own religion? What happens to them if they do not gain the approval of these Western governments? I'm just using the US as an example because it has a very large footprint in this area. It can also ignore to the positive contributions of other religious actors who may not have the support of the US government or the Canadian government or what have you, right? So some religions, as I mentioned earlier, gets to be designated as dangerous or bad, and some others as moderate or good. But who's making all these decisions? Then that's the part that is problematic. And so as a result, scholars such as Hurd would prefer that governments keep out of these area altogether. As I've said, it's probably not realistic. In today's world, religion is both a source of extremism and as well as a victim of it, right? So there's a very recent New York Times report which found that in the last 8 years alone, attacks by white extremists, such as the one that occurred in New Zealand, took place in places of worship, right? And so all of these attacks are targeted at religious groups and immigrants of a particular faith. And so it's not really possible for governments to keep out of this business altogether. But if they do keep at it, right, it obliges them, being aware of these kinds of criticisms obliges them to be aware of the costs and consequences of whatever course of action that they decide to take. Now, part of the fear is that once you start looking at religion as some kind of special radioactive category, right, that needs official attention, then you lose sight of all the other, important goals, right? So that was part of the thinking behind the creation of the broader Human Rights Office here in Canada that replaced the Religious Freedom Office. And of course, it's true that people have more complex lives than just being religious believers, right? So I'm more than just a Catholic, for instance. And we should care about all our human rights in general and not just about religion. But it's also true that people are being targeted because they're religious and of a particular faith, right? And so, so what do we do given this situation? I think the first step has to do with education, as with everything else, right? And particularly public religious literacy should be on everyone's agenda, not just the government's. We want to be able to educate ourselves and everyone else that religions are complex, and that especially mainstream liberals or progressive secular elites who think that religion should have no place in public discourse should take religion more seriously as it is, because if there's anything that we've learned in a lot of these recent tragic events, we know that these kinds of debates that we're having in Canada, in the US, these are usually fodder for what ends up in somebody's manifesto halfway across the world. So these debates that we have here in Canada, for example, are not really that local anymore, right? And so one of the other things that, apart from education, is that when it comes to governments promoting religious freedom on its own or are part of a general human rights package, we want our governments to take religion seriously and in a way that it is for believers in that country. So it might vary from one place to another, right? It's something that gives them, it's not only about belief, but also about identity and community. And so governments have to take those complexities into account when they promote religious freedom abroad. For example, when making it a condition of aid and funding. So it'll be hard to do that if we have the mindset that we have here domestically, that religious language have no place in the political arena, right? So if religious freedom is an issue that is only of concern to religious believers, then that's a dangerous path going forward. It's something that should be the concern of everyone, either religious or not. I think I'll just stop there because I don't have the
Because
time.
you've hit 12 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Su, for your comments. Unfortunately, my esteemed colleague has stolen about half my remarks. So the title of my forthcoming book, Law, Politics, and Countering Violent Extremism, deals with a critique of the question of CVE, and it joins the only real other book that really, from an academic perspective, really engages in a comprehensive critique of CVE. Arun Gundani's excellent book, The Muslims Are Coming. But Gundani's book is very much focused on an ideological question or an ideological framing. It was published by Verso Books around the question of CVE, whereas I'm much more interested in a discursive framing of how CVE operates, and domestically rather than foreign. So because Dr. provided my colleague provided an excellent framing of sort of what CVE is and how governments have been thinking about the question of extremism and the regulation of extremism, I want to maybe take a step back to this question about the place of extremism and what does religion offer us when we think about extremism in Canada, when we think about what is the role of religion in dealing with these sociological issues that are in Canada today. So I wanted to start then by thinking about the ayah of the Quran, the verse from the Quran, Ya ahl kitabi la taghlu fi dinikum, that, O people of the book, O people of faith, do not be extreme in your religion. Ghalu, if we go back to its original root in Arabic, means an archer who has cast an arrow and it's gone too far. And it's completely missed the target. So both people have fired the arrow, but one person has landed, in Narnia, and the other person has, maybe hit the target. That is the conception. So within the Islamic corpus, there has been a long-standing discussion about the avoidance of extremism. Initially, many of the mufassirin and the muhaddithin, the people who studied the Quranic exegesis and those who studied the hadith literature, focused on the question of ghalu as a question of personal religious praxis. For example, Ibn Abbas talked about in his description of this word ghalu as referring to people who were overzealous in their personal religion. So they would be praying all night. They'd be fasting every single day. They would ignore the concerns, the material concerns of their family around them. There's a famous tradition where a companion of the Prophet, whose name was Uthman ibn Maz'un, was engaged in constant self-purification, fasting every single day, praying all night, and his wife complained to the Prophet, saying, essentially he's ignoring, and I'm just sort of paraphrasing this long tradition, beautiful tradition, but essentially he's ignoring our family, this is maybe gone a little much, and the Prophet responds very beautifully to tell him that I am a prophet, and in that one I'm the best of you, but I pray and I eat, I sleep and I break my fast. And so the discussion of extremism within the Islamic corpus, especially initially, was very much framed around the question of personal religious praxis. But that doesn't mean that Muslims weren't thinking about acceptable views on a variety of subjects. One of the 4 sources of religious law in Islam is ijma'. It is consensus. So the question of what is moderation, what is the middle way, because Islam commands its adherents to adhere to ummat al-wasat, the religion of the middle way, has always been a question within the Islamic corpus in general. And it is a contested question, defining what is consensus, what is ijma', what are things that people really agree upon, is not something that's straightforward, especially given Islam's lack of a papacy and of a clear designated, especially in Sunni Islam, of a clear designated flow of religious authority. That has been a complicated question. But what I also wanted us to think about is to think about extremism not necessarily as a political question. So oftentimes here, especially in North America and in Europe, we think of the question of religious extremism, especially in the context of Islam, as a question of a securitization discourse. So we think of extremism as linked to terrorism. And I want to problematize that because a review of the academic literature actually shows us that the linkage between religious extremism as such and the actual actus reus, the actual act of terror that causes violence, that causes destruction, the link between those two may not actually be as strong as we might sort of intuitively think it is. Continued studies show that there's a minimal correlative link between religious extremism as such and the actual act of terror. So it's important to sort of disentangle these two concepts, which often in our mind are very hard to disassociate. And it very much shows up in the way that people have thought about, first calling it countering extremism, then calling it countering violent extremism. Now Donald Trump calling it countering Muslim violent extremism because he wanted to make sure there was no ambiguity about what he was looking at. This question about what does it mean to be extreme as a function of securitization discourse is something I want to problematize. But it also doesn't mean that religious extremism or views that we might find extreme is necessarily morally acceptable. I think it is a question of morality, and it is a question that we as the Muslim community have to think about. Because it is true, it is just simply a matter of fact that there are veins of what we might find to be unacceptable discourses within the Muslim corpus. For example, there is anti-Semitism within the Muslim community. There are voices in the Muslim community that have problematic views on the status of women, that have problematic views on the relationship between Muslims and minorities. At the same time, though, by framing this conversation in the same way that we view major sociological change around how we view the status of women or around the creation of the post-colonial, those have to be engaged as internal discussions, important internal discussions that other voices can feed into, but not necessarily a securitization question. These are important discussions that people within the Muslim community need to keep having, that need to be informed, that need to be challenged, that conservative voices need to be pushed back on, that liberal voices need to take into account. It's the beginning of that real imagination, that real intervention, that real imagination of what it means to be a Muslim, a Canadian Muslim in the 21st century. And in that sense, because we need to engage these folks who have what we deem to be unacceptable ideas, and we need to engage those folks in a way that speaks to their framing of religious texts, of religious praxis, we actually need to engage in a more robust and serious discussion about religion. So we need more religion, not less. And if we don't talk about religion, we may actually end up not seeing those issues properly. If we have seen anything through what we might broadly term the secular critique, and my old professor and the late professor Sabah Mahmood at Berkeley would have a problem with me saying the secular critique as such, given its highly contextual and contested nature of what that is. What we can broadly term as this critique of, we have to exclude religion and we have to exclude this question of religious discourse. I think there's a pretty clear way that we can see that that hasn't necessarily worked to bridge this divide between folks. In other words, approaching things and trying to divorce religion from the public discussion has not necessarily allowed us to sort of bridge the divide between folks. And in that sense, we need to re-engage in religious discussion, not disengage in religious discussion. And it's also important to think that this is not merely a matter of sort of mitigating the harms of religion. Because I think that there's a way in which it's time to see that religion, in its essence, is not just simply an absence of evil or it could be morally neutral. I think it can be an incredible force for good. And I think answers from the Islamic, the Baha'i, the Judeo-Christian traditions of the good are more relevant today than perhaps they've ever been before. And as we engage in a world where the wealth gap between the richest and the poorest has never been greater, where the rise of what we might broadly term, the alt-right movement rears its head in Europe and North America, as we sort of engage in the malaise of the postmodern, to riff off Charles Taylor's Malaise of Modernity and his famous CBC lecture series, we have more and more folks asking, why? Why am I here? What is my purpose? Slavoj Žižek recently, in what he self-describes as his magnum opus, in his book called The Parallax View, talks about while the 20th century could be crudely described through Weber's Protestant ethic, Žižek describes a lack of certainty to encourage a revitalization of what he might call the Eastern ethic. That is, more and more people sort of turning to the sort of eat, pray, love method. And of course, Žižek is quite pejorative in thinking about that. But I think this question for the search for authenticity has never been more important than it is today. And in that way, we return to religion that enables us to, as T.S. Eliot would say, to go to the place from which we came and to know it for the first time. Thank you very much. I look forward to our continued discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a very low voice, I'm sorry. Thank you, Rabbi Cutler, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this very necessary and timely discussion. And I'm very thankful to be sharing the panel with such wonderful expertise, both from a comparative analysis perspective and also from a domestic perspective on extremism, polarization, socially divisive narratives, and the interface with religion. Yes, sorry. Is that better? Good. As Director for Democracy, Inclusion, and Religious Freedom at Global Affairs, my work is much more focused on international engagement, but it's of course inspired and shaped by domestic realities. And so I'd like to take a little bit of time and spend some time to talk to you about the work that Canada does internationally to advance human rights and inclusion and respect for diversity. As has been noted, throughout the world, we're bearing witness to the fact that hateful and discriminatory rhetoric and extremism appears to have become increasingly normalized. And the government of Canada is concerned by all forms of violent extremism, not associating this phenomenon with solely a particular group, whether it be religious, cultural, ethnic, or national. We see throughout the world that violent attacks motivated by extremism and corrosive social narratives are happening on a daily basis. And as it's been mentioned already, we've borne witness to some of the most atrocious attacks in the last few weeks, whether it be in Sri Lanka on Easter or in New Zealand at Muslim mosques. or even over the weekend in California at the synagogue. These attacks have laid bare how vulnerable our societies are becoming and are being targeted by violent extremism, and how hatred is exploited to advance corrosive narratives that contribute to polarization. As the Prime Minister has noted, we must cast the light on this hatred and on our unwillingness to call it out. As leaders, as privileged few with power and an audience, we have the responsibility to do something. And this responsibility is not negotiable, is not waived when it's politically convenient. As a diplomat, when we represent Canada abroad, we stand in opposition to these corrosive narratives of intolerance and exclusion. Instead, we champion inclusion and respect for diversity. But we also do this from a place of humility, because as Mr. Ray noted this morning, Canada hasn't always gotten it right, and our own history is filled with dark chapters of exclusion and discrimination. So our work at Global Affairs stems both from our domestic experiences and the lessons that we've learned and continue to learn as a multicultural, multi-faith, and multi-ethnic society. And at times, these lessons are humbling. Canada is not immune to hate, but we can't shy away from talking about this and from speaking about this, even internationally. It's difficult to talk about the fact that anti-Semitic hate crimes in Canada have increased by 63% in 2017. And Jews are the most likely religious group in Canada to be targeted for hate crimes, comprising 18% of all hate incidents in Canada, despite the fact that statistics tell us that the Jewish population or Jewish communities represent less than 1% of Canadian population. It's equally difficult to talk about the fact that in 2017, police reported hate crimes against Muslims went up by 250%. Since 2016. And this is only police-reported hate crimes. But it's also not the whole story. And Rabbi Cutler and my colleagues have talked about, Rabbi, you referred to rings of peace. This is a demonstration of community resilience that exists in Canada. It's a demonstration of deep respect for diversity and inclusion that exists at the community level. And so this is something that we want to talk about and need to talk about at the international level as well. And so it's against this backdrop that I'd like to briefly explain the functions of the Office of Human Rights, Freedoms, and Inclusion. And I guess I'd start at this point on this topic by saying that there might be a misunderstanding that the Office of Religious Freedom was shut down, but rather, it was not shut down. It was actually broadened. And I'll explain what we mean by this. So the office is housed within our Foreign Ministry, Global Affairs Canada, and it's been at the forefront of policy development and advocacy for human rights, democracy, and advancing positive narratives on inclusion and respect for diversity as a key foreign policy priority for Canada. And this includes freedom of religion or belief. On May 17th, 2016, the government announced the establishment of this broader office to expand and to build on the work of the former Office of Religious Freedom, while embracing a broader spectrum of all human rights. So the office leads Canada's work to strengthen engagement on these issues in multilateral fora like the UN General Assembly, the UN Human Rights Council, the Organization of American States, the International Contact Group on Freedom of Religion or Belief, just to name a few. It convenes partners to address issues of such as freedom online, freedom of religion or belief, the rights of women and girls, the rights of LGBTI communities, protecting human rights defenders, and threats to democracy. And it works to leverage Canada's international actions and contributions to promoting and protecting human rights, diversity, inclusion, through projects that are supported by Canada's peace and stabilization operation programs internationally. The division that I lead, Democracy, Inclusion, and Religious Freedom, is the lead policy development shop and international engagement to promote these very topics. We also serve as the focal point for and with faith and belief communities and organizations in Canada. And our approach to community engagement acknowledges the particular role that faith and belief leaders play in championing a common message of human dignity, one that reconciles viewpoints and transcends divisions. And my team works to identify opportunities to organize interactive discussions with civil society organizations, with faith and belief communities, and senior officials at Global Affairs, other senior officials within the Government of Canada, political leadership, and special guests, such as the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. We've also worked to enhance a greater understanding of world religions within global affairs itself, so within global affairs with our colleagues within the department. And as our former Deputy Minister and now Clerk of the Privy Council, Ian Shugart, has said, ideas matter. Any representative of Canadian foreign policy has to know that over 80% of the world lives in connection with religious belief. And we should be able to discuss this in a civil and persuasive and listening manner. And it's in this vein that we've pioneered within Global Affairs the Religious Literacy Series. This series is designed to offer an opportunity for officials to develop a better understanding of world faith and belief traditions. And it also offers an analysis of current trends, challenges facing faith and belief communities, in order to engage constructively with these communities when colleagues are posted abroad, and when we as representatives of Canadians are speaking about Canadians internationally. The sessions to date have included a session on understanding Islam, a session on humanism and atheism, a session on indigenous spirituality, and also on the changing face of Christianity internationally. And our next session will focus on Judaism. Especially relevant to this conversation is the part of our work to combat hate speech, polarization, extremism, and their corrosive narratives. Canada is also advancing a positive story around inclusion and respect for diversity. We believe that it's not enough to say what we're against, but it's really also important to say what we are for. And in particular, Canada recognizes that freedom of religion or belief is an important component to peaceful, democratic, and inclusive societies. And its repression can undermine these values and engender extremism and radicalization, which can ultimately lead to violence. So this is the discourse that we are promoting internationally. But we realize that we can't tackle these issues as a standalone country, and that we need to work with other countries, and we need to work with other organizations and with civil society.
One more minute.
One more minute, oh boy. And so this is why Canada co-chairs the International Contact Group on Freedom of Religion or Belief with the US. This is an organization that we have established, that Canada has established, and that brings together over 30 countries that are dedicated to promoting and protecting freedom of religion or belief as it is reflected in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. I think I'll stop there because I hope that I'll get questions. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. This conference up to this point, including this panel, has used some very nice words. We talk about inclusion, we talk about diversity, we talk about pluralism. These are all wonderful concepts in theory. But in practice, they're much trickier because there is at least some level of implication of accepting of all views, that diversity is everybody. But the idea for this afternoon is extremism, polarization, and an implied assumption that these things are bad. Mustafa spoke about internal and external. The need to have an internal critique, and I think that's true for all faith traditions. But also, and this is me reading into it, there is some level of fear of a critique from the outside. And Professor Su spoke about a phrase which actually I jotted down just before you said it, the need to differentiate, or the implied differentiation between bad religion and good religion. And this is something which Global Affairs Canada, to some extent, from the remarks that you gave, is engaging with. And so my question for the panel is, if we are on the one hand promoting ideas of diversity and inclusion and pluralism, how do we also at the same time say, but there is a limit to that? And who are we to choose? And is it better for it to come from the outside, from a foreign government, from another religion, from a critique that doesn't come from within? Or is it better to come from within your own faith tradition? And if so, if it's only coming from within and that's not succeeding, what do we do then? So it's a big question that I'm hoping each of you can address, and then we'll open up to questions from the floor. And whoever wants to jump in first is welcome to do so.
I can say, so first of all, I think your question is an important question. It's a question that is critical to think about, because there is a way in which it can become very easy to sort of stand on the fluff piece and ignore the real complexities of this kind of discussion. Mm-hmm. But to clarify my remarks, I want to make it clear that my critique is about the securitization rhetoric around extremism. Not that academic or non-academic critique of Islamic praxis or religious praxis is problematic. I think that kind of critique is actually critical because it helps inform dialogue within those important internal conversations. But when it is in fact those external critiques that helps drive those religious conversations, that helps drive our understanding of what does it mean to have, what does the rights of women look like as acceptable within the Islamic discourse, for example. So I think that external critique is incredibly valuable. What is less valuable in my study is when governments, policymakers, and others engage in a sort of haphazard association of extreme viewpoints with a direct linkage to violence. And assuming that if they are able to target, using what governments typically use to target those extreme attitudes, that they will see a reduction in the impugned conduct, i.e. the terrorist actions themselves. So I think it's important for us to engage with those morally repugnant ideas that we find, whether through internal critique or external critique, but it's also important for us to be nuanced and for us to be informed by the literature, which again seems to demonstrate a minimal linkage between those extremist ideas and the impugned act of terror.
Okay, I think that's the million-dollar question, right? In a way, the question is like, to what extent can liberalism tolerate illiberal values? Many societies, I mean, the U.S., in the West, I mean, so U.S., Canada, many places in Europe has given an answer to that question, that there are limits to there are limits to what liberalism, or like what the liberal democratic state can tolerate. And but I do think if religious freedom is to still have any kind of meaning, there has to be space given to religious communities to, I mean, Mustafa's right? Like, you need to have space. We need to give these faith communities a space in order for people within that community to be able to critique their own tradition, to have that conversation, because these religions are very complex, right? Like, there's a huge debate right now, for example, I mean, this is not about extremism and polarization, but there's a huge debate going on within the Catholic Church about the place of LGBT people, right? So even they need to have that kind of venue so that the people of people of the same religion can debate it. Now, it's a different story if the government comes in and says, like, no, you can't believe these things because that's going to be contrary to our liberal values. So I think there's a different obligation when it's the government coming in. But religions have always been responding to these external challenges since time immemorial, right? After 9/11, for example, there have been like a lot of these conversations about, is Islam compatible with democracy, especially during the reconstruction after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And there were so many Muslim scholars who came up with the answer of course, yes. The answer is yes, right? Just to give a more antiquated example, so for many, many centuries, the Catholic Church has not really believed that religious freedom is something that is, that religious freedom is something of an error. That's a bit of an understatement, but they changed their mind, right? After like so many years. And so, there has to be, of course, religions engage with the challenges of the time that they find themselves in. It's always different. It's always different given a particular society, given a particular time and place. But again, so the only point of my remarks is simply to say that when it's the government doing something, there are certain obligations that they have to attend to.
I guess from a global affairs perspective and from a Government of Canada perspective, I wouldn't necessarily say that we engage in a critique of particular religions per se. What we do try to do is encourage an inclusive approach, encourage and try to share best practices by critiquing ourselves. So at the international level, being able to share Canada's dark chapters or the fact that hate crimes are on the rise is a way to bring the conversation to a different level, and to say, if these problems exist in Canada, here's what we're trying to do to tackle them. How can we share our good practices with you, and what can you do to share? What are you doing in your countries, and how can you share your best practices with us? One of the things that for us has been really important is language. Language matters. The way you name things matters. And so I guess you could call it a critique in a certain way. What we've been trying to do is, for instance, at the United Nations through existing resolution text, is to change words like tolerance, to change words that don't embrace inclusion and respect for diversity by words with respect for diversity. So it's a long game effect. It's not something that's going to change in a year, in 2 years, and in 4 years. It's really changing the hearts and minds of those countries that we're trying to work with, to bring them to walk together to a different level of understanding around inclusion.
Thank you. I'm going to open up to the floor. There is a microphone up to my right. It's better if you use it, but if you can't, just be really loud. And if no one has any questions or comments, okay, fantastic.
Mustafa, you said...
And just please introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name is Brian Caruana. I run a World Religion Center. Mustafa, twice you said that there's not much of a link between extreme views and violence. I just wondered if you could expand on that. I don't know if you just meant lots of extremists, lots of people with extreme views don't become violent, or you meant something else. And can I ask a second question, since there's not a lot of hands?
Why don't you ask it now? I'll decide later if they're going to answer it.
My second question is for Giuliana. You mentioned about getting away from tolerance. There is a scholar named Lars Konder, a Scandinavian, who argues that we used to understand tolerance not as always like the celebration of diversity, but the willingness to tolerate, to put up with something that we don't like, right, without acting violently. And this scholar made me think about the fact that we are sort of losing that in this society, and I wonder if there's some consideration of tolerance and putting up with something that that you find kind of difficult to tolerate.
Okay, Mustafa.
Yeah, so first of all, I guess shameless plug. If you get my book when it comes out, there's the book is about this question and engaging with some of the data.
There's an OWS discount code, right?
There is, yeah. But I think just sort of very, very broadly, I think there's a way in which we can understand that, as you rightly point out, that most people with what we might deem to be extreme views don't necessarily commit violent acts. And many people who commit violent acts, and there have been numerous studies, which I won't bore you, the audience, with, a recitation and of a meta-study of those that show that those who commit violent acts, and I specifically refer to North America and Europe. My study does not extend to what's going on in Pakistan or Egypt or countries like that. So there might be more interesting literature that comes out of there where we might have maybe a more complex view. But if we look at North American and European acts of terror and those who commit them, there's often a very loose linkage between those who commit those acts and their relationships with extreme ideas in religious terms. So obviously, I think it takes something extremely bad to do something extremely bad, of course. But in terms of their relationship with Islam, continued study shows that many of these people who commit these acts don't necessarily pray, engage in what we might generally term to be minimal orthodox behavior within the Islamic tradition. So again, there's lots to unpack here, there's lots to expand, but I think there's a large amount of literature that increasingly shows a minimal linkage between extremism and violence.
I am going to open up for another question. If not, we'll speak about tolerance. Don't feel awkward with asking it. I know that. We only have time probably for one more question. I want to give another question an opportunity.
Especially Giuliana, given the federal government's role vis-a-vis the provinces, what we have going on in Quebec right now with Bill 21, and how does that fit with our acceptance and view, and then we have this bill happening? Sorry, it's a tough
It is a tough question, and I'm sorry to have to say that my engagement is mostly focused internationally and not very much domestically. But of course, it does play a factor, and the international perception of what's going on in Canada does become influenced by other actors other than the federal government. I guess to that, I would just say that, so we don't talk about what happens at the provincial level internationally, but I think that our government officials have been very clear when we've talked about freedom of religion or belief writ large in Canada. And I mean, just to quote the Prime Minister, most recently he said, I think it's ridiculous that anyone would legislate someone according to their freedom of religion or belief. And I would just leave it at that.
Sorry, just to jump in, because it's something that I feel very passionate about, and it's also a topic that, and it's an area that NCCM, the organization for which I'm the executive director, is advocating very heavily on. But I think just to bridge off my esteemed colleagues' comments about whether liberal democracies can tolerate illiberal religious views, and sort of what Derrida said about to what extent can we tolerate intolerance. I think there's a way in which this is always pushed onto religious communities, but I think there's also a way in which, like if we look at laïcité, secularism, that it's actually imposed the opposite way. So literally imposing or invoking the notwithstanding clause to strip Canadians of their constitutional rights, and using what is really designed to be an emergency power to prevent people from wearing religious symbols, like the head cap, like the hijab, like the turban, from being able to just engage in certain positions, demonstrates that actually the purpose of religion to provide, a force of moral good is perhaps more important now than ever. So I'll end it at that.
Thank you. That actually brings us to 2 o'clock, and I'm getting you're about to get a gift of chocolates look from Jeffrey. So thank you all for being here, and thank you very much to my panelists.